Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Emmett webinar on fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses. Today's webinar is being co-hosted by Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, an organization for which I'm proud to say I serve as Vice President and Treasurer, and which focuses on fighting anti-Semitism in the academy and in particular at the faculty level. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing, so please share far and wide. If you have any questions for our speaker, please place them in the Q&A, and I'll get to as many as possible later in the program. I wanted to share that this will be my last webinar for Emmett, as after perhaps 15 years of working proudly alongside Sarah Stern to promote Emmett's work, I will be stepping down from my position there. I will continue my work fighting the battles for Israel and the Jewish people's survival, as well as U.S. national security, including focusing on campus anti-Semitism. So I can't think of a better webinar to end my time at Emmett than one with the brilliant Kenneth Marcus, who has been a friend of both Emmett and SPME, and whose work is critically important in this battle. Kenneth L. Marcus is founder and chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University, and author of The Definition of Anti-Semitism and Jewish Identity and Civil Rights in America. During his public service career, Ken served as Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education for Civil Rights, Staff Director at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and General Deputy Assistant U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. He also serves by gubernatorial appointment as a member of the Board of Visitors at George Mason University, and formerly served as a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the university's law school. I'm not going to read Ken's entire impressive bio, but it was included in the invitation for today's webinar. He's published in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Newsweek, USA Today, and Politico, and I urge you all to follow his very important work. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, Ken. We have a lot.
With you.
Thank you. We have a lot to talk about, and I think the best place to start is how we got here. You've been working in this space for a very long time because, unlike average Americans and American Jews in particular, you recognize that we have a serious problem in the academy. I mean, I too started working in this space many years ago and joined SPME and did some speaking, but there were really deaf ears until October 7th. And that kind of, the genie exploded out of the bottle, and all have kind of woken up to how dire things really are on our campuses. So can you just spend some time initially talking about cultural Marxism, DEI initiatives, and other factors that have fanned the flames of Jew hatred on our campuses?
Certainly, Laurie, and let me say that I'm not only glad personally to be with you, especially after you've made this announcement that this will unfortunately be your last one of these webinars, but also it has always been an honor to work shoulder to shoulder, not just with you, but also with Sarah Stern and Endowment for Middle East Truth. And I will say that some of the earlier work that I did in fighting anti-Semitism was as part of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, where I served on the board of directors many years ago. I have been on this issue for well over 20 years, having been initially concerned at some of the severe anti-Zionist incidents that were clearly a cloak for anti-Semitism at around the time of the onset of the Second Intifada in the immediate wake of 9/11. I saw on many college campuses and also reports from Europe and the Middle East what appeared to be a series of incidents that were more intense and different in kind than what I had seen before. I was at the time a civil rights enforcement official, but my focus had not been on anti-Semitism, but rather on all of the various sorts of hate and bias facing other groups. I had thought at that time that my background as a Jewish person would give me a sense of the importance of fighting back against discrimination. Did not realize until I started seeing incidents in the 2001-2002 timeframe that there was the potential that things would worsen, perhaps even to the extent where anti-Semitism became a very substantial and significant problem that had to be dealt with. First in the George W. Bush administration, then in various other capacities, including on the faculty of CUNY, then at the Louis D. Brandeis Center, I have realized that it was necessary to fight back against anti-Semitism on and off college campuses using not only education, but also using law and policy as a means of ensuring that Jewish students, Jewish faculty, and other Jewish Americans are able to protect our rights, our interests, and to make sure that we have the same equal protection as every other student. Now, Laura, you asked me specifically about a few more recent trends in higher education. You were talking about, I think, DEI, cultural Marxism. Those weren't necessarily the issues that I was seeing in 2002, 2003, 2004. What I was seeing at that time was a resurgence of anti-Semitism, including through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that was just in its very earliest moments. But it has, even over the course of 20 years, evolved and mutated in different ways. Some of the more recent ideologies that have become fairly widespread on college campuses and off college campuses have been more on the left. I should say that right-wing anti-Semitism is also a concern on the street, and it's something that we have dealt with when it comes to the efforts of the Louis D. Brandeis Center. But since this session deals specifically with the college campus, I would say that it is those left-wing ideologies that have been driving much of what we're seeing.
Thanks, Ken. I actually used to argue with people which is worse, the anti-Semitism from the left or from the right. And my argument was always from the left, it's more insidious because it's impacting ideology and thought in a different way than right-wing anti-Semitism is. But that's for another webinar, I suppose. So tell me.
If someone asks me whether I want to get punched from the left or punched from the right, I would say no, I don't.
Right.
I want to block those punches wherever they're coming.
Right, exactly. So Ken, what role do you think that the foreign money has had on campus anti-Semitism? Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been funding universities to the tune of billions and billions of dollars over decades. Do you believe that the Trump administration and/or Congress should get involved in either cutting off foreign funding, in particular federally funded academic institutions, or some sort of transparency on what's being funded with these foreign dollars? And in this regard, I also note that several watchdog groups recently filed a FOIA lawsuit against the Department of Education seeking records relating to Qatar's funding of our universities.
I definitely think that this foreign funding plays a significant and harmful role. Some of the funding clearly has negative intentions. Some of it might not have negative intentions, but nevertheless still has positive effects, even if some of these countries are subsidizing U.S. universities to have campuses in their country, and their primary intention is simply to educate their own students. Nevertheless, it has lots of different negative effects, including, for instance, U.S. students are going over there, getting brainwashed and coming back. U.S. faculty are going over there, not only getting propagandized, but not having academic freedom and being essentially restricted in what they can say. And then some of these countries that are no friends of the United States end up having disproportionate influence over U.S. higher education institutions. And that's in the best case scenario. There are other foreign entities that seem to be providing funds with a more serious negative intent. At a minimum, there needs to be disclosure, and that disclosure needs to be enforced with measures that have teeth to them. That is to say, if one is caught as a university failing to disclose significant foreign funding, the punishment shouldn't be a rap on the knuckles. It should be at a minimum a very substantial fine, enough to deter further bad behavior. We should be concerned both about money that's pouring into U.S. universities and having a negative influence on the curriculum as well as on the way they address anti-Semitic incidents. We should also be concerned about foreign funding to student groups and protesters who are using these funds, it seems, to fuel protest activities. It's very difficult to trace the money. We have a lot more in the way of suspicions than what we have in proof, but it's something that we're looking at. It's something that we're investigating, and it's something for which we think the perpetrators will ultimately need to be held accountable, perhaps in the court of law, which is where we typically want to put them.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the funding of the student protests also. That's critically important. So let's talk about faculty for a minute. I'm guessing that, like me, you're thrilled that Trump is now taking steps to deport foreign students who support terrorist organizations. But what about faculty? SPME focuses on faculty because while students come and go, the faculty are there for the long haul, and they're influencing the hearts and minds of generations of young people. So can you talk about where tenure comes into this, the big picture of whether we can see some of these influential yet anti-Semitic faculty members who are violating student civil rights as well as campus codes of conduct can be fired?
Faculty is a big issue, and there are different parts of it, not just tenure, but other elements of it. I completely agree with your premise, which is that you cannot solve the problems we're facing in higher education without having a faculty piece of the solution. For example, we might eliminate all of the problems of unlawful DEI that are addressed in the recent executive order of President Trump, and still not get to the root of those problems that are perpetrated by the faculty, using not just administrative DEI approaches, but also whether it's a critical race theory or post-colonialism or other sorts of ideologies that are poisoning the atmosphere on campus. And they are using their power in shared governance to eliminate discipline for perpetrators and to misshape the education students are receiving. Tenure is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it means that there are faculty wrongdoers who are protected from appropriate accountability. On the other hand, there are members of faculties who will speak the truth and who will have rare common sense and be badly outnumbered at the university. For example, there are universities that have very few pro-Israel faculty members in important positions. If you eliminate tenure, the first to go might not be the perpetrators, it might be the good guys. If Columbia University, for example, were to eliminate tenure anytime soon, which it will not, but if it did, I don't think that Joseph Massad would be the first to lose his job. I think it might be someone like Shai Davidai, who has courted controversy by speaking the truth and doing it with courage. So it seems to me that tenure is a double-edged sword, but there are other ways of dealing with faculty. So here's one. You might have noticed we had an important settlement just very recently with Harvard University, in which Harvard is taking very strong measures to deal with anti-Semitism, including as a part of our settlement agreement, they are agreeing to use the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, not just as an educational tool, but actually in their disciplinary process. Well, this has been great news for those of us who care about anti-Semitism, but terrible news for those people who are perpetrating anti-Semitism. There are already a couple of faculty members, instructors at Harvard University, who have announced that they are going to leave Harvard University because they are so upset with what's been happening. Well, this sort of self-termination of faculty isn't necessarily a bad thing. For those faculty members, and at least one of them at Harvard has said this, for those faculty members who say that their scholarship would be considered anti-Semitic within the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and then they are concerned that people are going to start censoring themselves. My feeling is that if they are anti-Semitic bigots, it is okay for them to censor themselves. In other words, it is okay for them to think twice before they engage in anti-Semitism and hold their tongue. And if they're unable to do that, then resigning from institutions of higher learning wouldn't be a terrible thing either. And I have to say, I am not crying crocodile tears over those Harvard instructors who are now quitting Harvard University out of fear of what's going to happen in the wake of that settlement.
So I'm glad you brought the settlement up. I was going to ask you about it a little bit later, but let's talk about it. You had called the Harvard settlement a watershed moment, and you stated, quote, "We expect that it will have an extraordinary impact for colleges and universities around the country. There is now a Harvard standard that other colleges will need to strive to meet." So you've mentioned the IRA definition, but can you also elaborate on what that standard is and whether you think other schools will in fact follow suit? Because schools like Columbia, which you brought up, Columbia receives a $6 billion taxpayers endowment over the past, or funding over the past 5 years, $6 billion. And you brought up Joseph Massad. For those that don't know, Joseph Massad is the professor who called the Hamas attack on Israel, quote unquote, awesome, because of the astounding sight of Palestinian resistance fighters. He's now teaching a course on Zionism and the history of Israel this semester. And there's also that woman that maybe some of you remember who was begging for humanitarian aid when the pro-Hamas rioters took over Hamilton Hall. She was arrested, and now she's been rewarded by Columbia with a teaching position. So this Harvard standard, if you can share it with us and then share with our audience whether you think it will trickle down to other universities, would be great. Thanks, Ken.
Sure. Harvard isn't the first university that either under pressure of litigation or federal investigation or otherwise has agreed recently to improve their policies, especially when it comes to the definition of anti-Semitism, but it's perhaps the most recent and most prominent. And other institutions do frequently copy or emulate what is done at Harvard University. So what Harvard agrees to do isn't just influential in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but also all throughout the United States. In settling a case brought by the Brandeis Center, and also there was a case brought by another firm as well, Harvard University agreed to a substantial and robust package of measures. It wasn't just any one thing. It was a lot of different pieces to it. So the most prominent, perhaps, is that Harvard agreed that in its non-discrimination matters, it would use the IRA, or International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism. That is the so-called gold standard definition of anti-Semitism that makes it clear that while not every form of criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, many of them are, gives key examples so that people will understand that anti-Zionism tends to be a form of anti-Semitism and is largely, if loosely analogous to Natan Sharansky's famous 3D test, which is to say the notion that something may be anti-Semitic if it involves a demonization, delegitimization, or different standards when it comes to the state of Israel. This definition was embraced during the George W. Bush administration, both at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which at the time I directed, and then also at the State Department. But it was also used and more formally adopted in a slightly different form by the Biden administration under Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. During the Trump 1 administration, it was elevated to an executive order, and then it was used again, although perhaps differently, during the Biden administration. It is now embraced by approximately 2/3 of our states. It is the consensus definition, to the extent that there is one, of anti-Semitism in this country, and it makes clear, despite protests from left-wing activists on college campuses, that some forms of discrimination against Zionists, typically they will be discrimination against Jews. That's very important. Harvard also agreed to clarify very specifically and with very useful language lots of different anti-Zionist activity that are also anti-Semitic. Rules against Zionists are rules against Jews. Universities need to recognize that. The University of California at Berkeley has not recognized that, and that's why we've sued them, and we have a case pending in federal district court in California. We see many different universities where the administrators are reluctant to acknowledge that a rule against Zionists is a rule against Jews. At the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, UIUC, we were able to enter first into a joint statement with Chancellor Jones and then a resolution agreement and side agreement in which the university similarly agreed to take this notion that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and integrate it into their policies. We've been doing it elsewhere as well. At Harvard, they also agreed to other remedies, including having the Brandeis Center do educational programming there. Also, the Kennedy School students whom we represent, who were prevented from discussing Israel as a Jewish democracy to a particular classroom, are now going to be able to design coursework for the entire school, programming for the entire school on that topic. So the notion that one simply cannot talk about Israel as a Jewish democracy because it was forbidden in a classroom at the Harvard Kennedy School now will be taught more broadly. So a number of different pieces, but the most important ones involve making sure that Harvard is on record clearly, and not just in its education, but also in its non-discrimination policy, that punishing Zionists is punishing Jews, and Jews are as protected as anyone else from discrimination. So it is an important development from Harvard that we hope to see emulated around the country.
Terrific. That's great work, Ken, and great news for everyone to bring the truth back to campus. So in talking about the IRA definition, it reminds me of the Antisemitism Awareness Act. And I want to ask you your thoughts on why it seems that confronting and stopping anti-Semitism has become such a partisan issue and what that means in the long run in terms of winning this battle. I mean, you talked about anti-Zionism, and people can disagree on post-10/7 strategies of Israel, but anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism in 2024, and this is a cultural issue, and I don't see that the Democrats are really addressing it as such. So there might be some in the audience who are disagreeing with my premise on this being a partisan issue, but I just, Ken, you mentioned that Biden's Department of Education took Trump's executive order, which in essence codified the Antisemitism Awareness Act that had passed the House of Representatives last year. I didn't see them doing much with it, but in the meantime, the Antisemitism Awareness Act was held up in the Senate by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who refused to join Republicans Mike Lawler, Elise Stefanik, and Virginia Foxx in visiting Columbia University in the midst of this anti-Semitic chaos. And Schumer instead instructed Columbia's president that, quote, her best strategy is to keep heads down in response to the violent and pervasive anti-Semitism on her campus because Columbia's, quote, political problems are really only among Republicans. And Ken, in this context, I really would love for you to share with your audience the experience that you just had with Virginia Democrats who blocked you from sitting on the board of George Mason University, which is appalling.
And thank you, Laurie. I'll start with the last piece, although I think the others are larger, so I'll try to spend a little bit more time. Thank you for mentioning, yes, I was very proud and pleased that Governor Glenn Youngkin nominated me to serve on the Board of Trustees at George Mason University in Virginia. We call it a Board of Visitors. Under the unusual rules here in Virginia, that means that one starts serving about 6 or 7 months ago. So I have been on the board and remain on the board for at least another few days at the George Mason University. You are right that by a party line vote, the state Senate voted against the nominees for George Mason, which included myself. That process is not over. In fact, the matter, including my own nomination, are likely to hit the floor of the House of Delegates in Virginia this afternoon. But it likely will continue perhaps until Friday. So I would say it's not over. While it's true that so far the votes have been party line, and in Virginia, Democrats have a majority of both the Senate and the House of Delegates. So that means that I was voted down in the Senate and had a negative vote in the House committee. Nevertheless, under the process there, it's continuing until it's over. And I have been heartened to see a very large show of support from Virginia Democrats as well as Republicans. They're not public officials, but many Virginia Democrats have reached out to me to say that they are writing to their state senators, writing to their delegates. The Jewish community of Virginia has been turning out. And I understand there are more people this afternoon who may be reaching out to the delegates and senators, and that's a good thing. I think it is important and valuable that the Jewish community have support among both Democrats and Republicans. You mentioned the Antisemitism Awareness Act. Let me supplement your discussion by adding a few things. First, I think it was a great sign yesterday when Congressman Moskowitz, a Democrat, joined Congressman Lawler, a Republican, in submitting a bipartisan Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in the House of Representatives. Reportedly, Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen is planning to join Republican Senator Tim Scott in introducing the Senate version of the same legislation. The fact that both versions of the bill are bipartisan, I think, is a very good sign. While it is true that last year that House run the Republican-run House of Representatives passed the Antisemitism Awareness Act and the Democratic-run Senate did not. Nevertheless, in the House of Representatives, I think it was notable that a significant majority of Democrats voted in favor of the bill, as did a significant majority of Republicans. It might be that the Republican tally was higher, but I do think that support among House Democrats has been useful. I also suspect that if there is a roll call vote in the Senate, that we will also see a majority of Democrats as well as a majority of Republicans voting in favor of it. Now, it may be that the Republican majority supporting will be higher than the Democratic majority. That is to say, neither caucus appears to be 100% in support, but both seem to be very much in support. And if Republicans are more heavily skewed in favor, that's a good thing. But let's not ignore the importance and the value of the support that Democrats are providing as well, especially some of the very many active and influential Jewish Democrats who are working very hard on this cause.
Well, I'll just add that, I mean, Richie Torres and John Fetterman are two of our best friends, both Democrats. But it does seem like the issue of anti-Semitism in Congress is becoming partisan, if not already. And you're right, we do have a lot of good friends on the Democratic side of the aisle also. So this actually takes me into my next question, which is about free speech. Democrats who refuse to support the Antisemitism Awareness Act claim that it impinges on free speech, and campus administrators who refuse to rein in violence, harassment, intimidation of Jewish students and faculty claim academic freedom. And it seems like there's no grown-up in the room on these campuses who simply says that violations of campus codes of conduct, let alone the civil rights of Jewish students, will be severely punished with expulsion. Takeover of Columbia's Hamilton Hall is an extreme example. Alvin Bragg let them all free. It doesn't seem like Columbia did too much with those students that violated campus rules and property. Columbia students just took over another building. They spray painted it and they poured cement down toilets. This is last week. Asaf Romorowski and I wrote an article many years ago entitled "College Administrators Must Address Anti-Semitism on Their Campuses." And we called for the adoption of IRA, among other things. That was well before the 10/7 atrocities. Anti-Semites on campus aren't going to stop until there's prices to pay. So do you think the college administrators are slowly waking up because there's going to be Trump pressure on them with, threats of pulling federal funds? But why is it that up until now, they haven't just said, okay, this is a violation of our rules of campus conduct and you're punished?
A lot there, Laurie. So to begin with, I would say that I share the concern of freedom of speech, but think that critics have it wrong. To begin with, too often it is Jewish and pro-Israel students who feel silenced, who are unable to speak their truth or express their identities as Jews and Zionists for fear not only of social stigma, but in some cases of physical violence. It is not aggressive enforcement, but the failure of enforcement that has led to censorship and silence. So if we care about free speech in the marketplace of ideas, what we need to do is to provide an even playing field and lack of double standards. Having said that, I do think that free speech is important when it comes to any form of enforcement, whether it's anti-Semitism or any other area. It just has to follow the same standards. Now, you asked me also about administrators and what they need to, what will make them do the right thing. I am so pleased that the Trump administration is coming in with very strong initial steps. It is one thing for a presidential candidate to speak in strong terms, but another for it to be followed up. We have seen the strong words of candidate Donald Trump echoed by the very strong actions by President Donald Trump with his executive orders in the first days of the administration. Importantly, we have also seen within just this week, within the last few days, that the White House statements or executive orders are being implemented already. not only with the task force newly formed out of the Department of Justice, but also with proactive investigations that have just been announced at the U.S. Department of Education by my successor at the Office for Civil Rights, and also at the Department of Health and Human Services, where I am glad there is now a recognition that in teaching hospitals and also other health sector institutions, the anti-Semitism that we've seen elsewhere on college campus is having a very deleterious effect, one which makes it difficult or impossible for certain Jewish medical practitioners to do their work, and which also is preventing Jewish patients from getting the level of care that they deserve.
I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think people realize, how much medical schools have been impacted by DEI, which then negatively impacts the Jewish students and patients, as you point out. Just trying to follow up with these claims of academic freedom, does that protect professors who also lie about Israel, the history of the region, the Palestinian people, the Holocaust-related topics? I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously stated that you are entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Aren't college classrooms places in which facts are supposed to be taught, and where the academic standards that govern what professors should and should not be doing when teaching a class, reach a certain level? And I just, I want to give a quick example. You brought up Berkeley, and I don't think I realized that Brandeis had sued Berkeley, but there's an event that I believe it just was held. It was organized by the school's Gender and Women's Studies Department, discussing Zionism that weaponizes feminism to promote genocide, and how the atrocities committed against Israelis on October 7th, including rape, were fabricated. Do the principles of academic freedom require that Berkeley allow this event to take place? Because the spokesperson for Berkeley stated that until such time as the academic senate determines that a faculty member's work is inconsistent with the university's academic standards, the university basically has to let it go on. So what does that say about Berkeley's academic standards if they're permitting an event that basically says that all of the women who were raped were lying on 10/7?
Yeah. So the Louis D. Brandeis Center absolutely has sued the regents of the University of California over what's happening on that campus, including based on incidents before as well as after October 7. Berkeley is the campus where my own alma mater, the law school at the University of California at Berkeley, adopted perhaps as many as 20 or 22 student organization constitutions and bylaws that bar Zionists from speaking. Berkeley is also the institution where students have been physically assaulted, including one hit over the head with a water bottle. I mention that because there are some thorny issues involving academic freedom at any institution, but we have to remember that there are simple issues also. The regents' communications representatives at one point insisted that there are free speech protections that they can't limit at the University of California. Well, nobody has the freedom of speech to hit a Jewish student over the head with a water bottle. There are some things that are happening at our colleges and universities that are so obviously illegal that there's not even an interesting question about whether there's speech or academic freedom. So I say that because it's true that there are interesting and difficult questions, but it's also true that even if one puts all of those questions aside, unquestionably what we're seeing from major universities is widespread violation of the basic civil rights of Jewish students and faculty. There are academic freedom protections in the classroom, but it's complicated. There are some exceptions to academic freedom doctrine, for instance, when it comes to extraneous material, which is to say, speaking on topics that are unrelated to the course. We've seen examples, including at California public institutions, of math and science professors spouting off extensively about Israel in classes that are in the STEM field. That is not an exercise of academic freedom. There are also rules regarding academic freedom, even as adopted by institutions like the American Association of University Professors, which caution instructors about introducing unduly controversial opinions into the classroom. So there are protections that one needs to think about. One needs to be careful before intruding into what truly is academic freedom, protected speech. But what we see much more often is abuse of academic freedom, with professors who are doing less teaching, more activism, and who are introducing extraneous propaganda and indoctrination into the classroom, as opposed to the sort of instruction that is rightly protected as academic freedom.
It just seems so perverse to me that someone like Joseph Massad is teaching a course on Zionism and the history of Israel at Columbia.
One couldn't
It's
easily
it's
imagine.
mind-boggling.
Yes.
So another follow-up on this topic, University of Michigan just suspended their Students for Justice in Palestine chapter for 2 years. I wish it had been permanently expelled from campus, but that's a good positive first step. There was an AMCHA study several years ago, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that revealed that where there's an SJP chapter on campus, there's a 7 times greater incidence of anti-Semitism on that campus. There's a lot of other bad organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace and some other Muslim student organizations, but SJP has been at the fore of perpetuating and fomenting Jew hatred on campus. So why do you think college administrators aren't actually throwing them off? Is this another free speech issue? And again, how do you balance that with violations of codes of conduct? Because these groups are shutting down pro-Israel speakers, events at Chabad's and Hillel's. Where do you draw the line?
Times are changing, and increasingly administrators are starting to realize that when extremist organizations that foment racial hatred are active on their campuses, there will be consequences for the institutions and consequences for which they may be held responsible. Just a few years ago, administrators were refusing to take any action, but increasingly, we and others in the Jewish community have been able to point to violations of student conduct code and other rules that have led to SJP chapters, Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, being suspended or otherwise removed, at least for a period of time. I think that Fordham University a few years ago showed exemplary leadership when it refused to recognize a chapter of SJP based on the obvious ground that SJP's values were inconsistent with those of Fordham University. Any university should ask the question, do we really think that SJP's values are consistent with our own? And if so, what does that really tell us? So we're now seeing increasingly that institutions are willing either to suspend or punish SJP for violations of their rules, or better yet, in some cases, to say, rather than waiting for SJP to violate our rules and harm our students, we should ask the question, is this chapter consistent with our values? And if not, eliminate them altogether. Beyond the basic incompatibility of SJP with university values and the fact that SJP chapters so frequently violate rules, there's also the large question, which the Brandeis Center and the Anti-Defamation League raised with many university presidents a year ago, which is that Students for Justice in Palestine at a national level has been making statements that appear not only to support Hamas with rhetoric, but also to appear to be providing a level of support for Hamas that may run afoul of national anti-terrorism law. That's an additional and very serious reason to take seriously the dangers posed by these organizations, where we're speaking of potential violence and also criminality.
Thanks, Ken. I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the discussions about shutting down the Department of Education. Trump talked about it as a candidate. He promised that it was something he was seriously going to look into. And this week, we're hearing that it's actually something that is on the table. So what are your thoughts on the likelihood that it will be shut down completely, or at least, parts of it will be significantly altered, and what that would mean for the discussion that we're having right now on campus anti-Semitism? Because under Trump, I would imagine that the DOE's Office of Civil Rights would be quite active in helping what you do at Brandeis and what we all want to see happen on campuses, which is shut down this horrific intimidation, harassment, and violence of Jewish students. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Government agencies can come and go. It's actually common for agencies to arise in response to a particular problem and then seem to stay around forever. But there certainly are precedents for closing agencies that no longer seem to be doing effective work. Years ago, I interned at the Interstate Commerce Commission at a time when commissioners were first asking whether they really need to continue as an institution. That agency was closed down several years after that. And yet it's not as if interstate commerce came to a halt when it did so. The Department of Education was created as a standalone entity only during the Carter administration. It hasn't been around forever. And during the period of its existence, I don't think anybody can point to improvements in the quality of American education. If anything, test scores among American students have declined during that period. It is quite possible to ask the question, has the Department of Education succeeded or failed? And if it has failed, time and time again, under administrations of different parties, then maybe there's a different way to address the problem. If the Department of Education is closed, that doesn't mean that all of its components will disappear. Under most of the proposals that I have seen, the civil rights arm of the Education Department, the so-called Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, which I ran during both the George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations, that would be handled elsewhere, perhaps under the Department of Justice. Now, if that were to happen, if the Justice Department were to absorb OCR, there are many ways of doing it. I could envision several different plans for merging OCR into the Department of Justice. Some of them would be better, some of them would be worse. Under some approaches, one could imagine a decrease in enforcement effectively, but under others, one could preserve 100% the quality of enforcement and perhaps even increase it. One could imagine ways of integrating OCR into the Department of Justice that would better combine the investigative forces of OCR with the litigation capacities of the Department of Justice to create more impactful responses from the federal government. So I think that those who are worried about the prospects of closing the Department of Education for anti-Semitism cases probably should take comfort in the notion that there are ways that this can be done that will actually lead to a significant net improvement in the quality of work that's done.
Great. So there's a lot of questions in the queue, and I want to be able to get to many of them. But before we do, I just want you to discuss the work that you're doing at the Brandeis Center and what you view as the strongest tools to address and help stem the tide of campus anti-Semitism. Lawfare, there's filing actions with OCR. We were talking about the DOE and DOJ. There's congressional action with the Antisemitism Awareness Act and Trump's executive orders. What are your if you can just share with our audience over the next 4 years, what you think a Trump administration that promises to make higher education great again will be doing, and tools that you at Brandeis and other people should be working on to help in this fight.
Sure, Laurie, thank you. Well, we are working on a number of different fronts. You mentioned lawfare. I would say in terms of filing lawsuits and fighting in court, that is an area where we are likely to have some announcements in the coming days. We have been significantly increasing our bandwidth in the area of litigation with a fairly strong unit dedicated just to that. But we are also, of course, still focused more than ever on the federal government and the ways in which federal funding or defunding can be used to ensure that institutions that rely on taxpayer support are meeting their obligations to the American people. With an incoming administration, the Trump II administration, that is very open to these issues, We are filing more complaints to give them more material to use in interacting with the administration in ways that we hope will continue to shape their response. We've also been active on the Hill and continue to do that, and probably will be expanding our work in that area as well. We testify frequently before Congress and work both on the oversight and also the legislative function. So what I would say is what one needs to do is both affirmatively fighting in courts, but also working on the policy side. We frequently work with students to help them to articulate their problems in ways that will have resonance with the administrators, which is to say, sometimes students come to us with something that turns out not to be a case, but where nevertheless there are issues that should be raised. We might raise them with the university on the student's behalf if that takes the pressure off of them, or if the students are open to speaking for themselves, we will help them to be much more effective at doing that. Sadly, we're also doing something more and more in recent months that we hadn't been doing so much in the past, and that's defending Jewish students, Jewish faculty, and other Jewish Americans who are falsely accused of things. Oftentimes, it is Jews who are standing up for their rights as Jews, as Israelis, as Zionists, and are getting punished for it. They might, for instance, be Jewish students who report an incident and who are told, listen, if you want us to believe your side of the story, bring us some evidence. So the student will then take a photograph or make a video and then be faced with a retaliatory complaint that in taking photographs or making videos, they're either doxing or harassing students, perhaps especially if the students are of a particular minority group. It might be an accusation of anti-Arab or anti-Muslim discrimination when the Jewish student simply tries to prove the harassment or bullying that they're facing. So we also do a significant amount of defense work as well for Jewish Americans who are falsely accused.
It's great work. It's such important work, Ken. We're really lucky to have you on our side. A number of people, thank you. A number of people are asking about K through 12 education, and one person in particular noted that the liberated ethnic studies that was being fought in California by the Deborah Project, they lost their lawsuit in LA, and it's being used by activists against the movement to address K through 12. Can you offer any suggestions in countering the teachers' unions, California State University and University of California professors and liberated consultants who are mobilizing teachers, students, and school board trustees to continue teaching anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian narratives to K through 12 students?
Laurie, that's a good question, and your audience is right to raise K-12. It is horrifying to have to say that we are seeing levels of anti-Semitism at K-12 institutions that resemble what we had been seeing on college campuses just a few years ago. This is a very significant change that's happened very recently, and that has potential long-term consequences. You had asked me earlier, Laurie, about the foreign influence on American campuses, and it's a real problem. I also worry that as younger students start entering the college campus after having been educated in American high schools, that the indoctrination that they are now for the first time facing in American schools could be a worsening influence on the college campus as well. But there are different kinds of problem we're seeing on college campuses. We're still seeing old-fashioned anti-Semitism of the, accusations of Jews being greedy or, conspiratorial or what have you. We're seeing students who are replicating the activism of their older siblings down to the verbatim chants that we're hearing on college campuses. We're now seeing them at walkouts in high schools. We are seeing anti-Semitism in high schools that is driven by teachers' unions. We're also seeing anti-Semitism in K-12 that is driven by the school boards themselves, often when they adopt ethnic studies or liberated ethnic studies programs that are based in part on anti-Jewish stereotypes and defamations. It is true that another organization's lawsuit was recently dismissed, but the Brandeis Center is suing it also in Southern California. We have a lawsuit with a number of partners, including Stand With Us, ADL, AJC, and other organizations against the Orange County Santa Ana public school system. That is, I think, an initial and important lawsuit, and we plan to do more as necessary. We are certainly looking at school districts around the country that have created a toxic environment for Jewish students. We have a team in Southern California, a team of lawyers that is leading the charge. So the Brandeis Center is open to hearing from parents and families around the country whose children are being harassed and bullied. There may be legal approaches that we have for them.
So a number of people are actually asking questions and looking for more detail on some of the Harvard stuff. I'm trying to consolidate some of these. Somebody asked what you think about the fact that Harvard's rules could punish people for taking a photo or video of someone on campus, making it available for download for purposes of embarrassing someone. Couldn't that be used against Jewish students who are videoing people who are harassing them or intimidating them? And somebody else asked, is Harvard going to punish chants of From the River to the Sea and globalize the Intifada?
Yeah. So first of all, we've got information about the Harvard settlement, including the basically the release, which sets forth all of the information that we're able to discuss, the non-confidential information that's not subject to a confidentiality order. It's on the Brandeis Center website, brandeiscenter.com. With a settlement, in addition to the components that I described before, what one creates is a kind of a structure under which the university handles their cases. That's never going to be perfect, but what it means is that there are going to be a better set of rules in general for reviewing these cases. Then, in addition to the pieces that I mentioned before, there will also be an anti-Semitism specialist who is hired to be a part of these reviews and who is overseeing the cases, and then conducting regular reports, including public reports, to make sure that there aren't double standards, so that however Harvard is addressing complaints by other groups, they're using the same standards and the same quality with respect to their Jewish students. In a settlement agreement, one never is able to encompass all of the different potential fact situations, but what one can do is create some policy rules and then standards and reporting and then oversight to improve the situation.
Someone asked, why can't non-citizen students and radical foreign professors who attack Jews or express support for foreign terrorist organizations be deported under, immigration rules that prohibit visas to those who endorse or espouse terrorist activity? I'd like to, we know that Trump has signed an executive order on this. I'd like to take it a step further and ask you whether foreign students and faculty have the same freedom of speech rights as U.S. citizens.
Well, they don't. And you're right, Laurie, that there is an executive order signed by the president very recently that provides for various cabinet level agencies, including education and homeland security and justice, to find ways of making clearer to universities that they can work with the federal government with respect to those members of their community who do not meet the admissibility requirements under immigration law. There is a role to be played by the public to the extent that one becomes aware of faculty or students who are engaged in anti-Semitic bullying and violating the terms of their visas. This is something that can be reported to Homeland Security, to ICE, also to the Department of Justice, and we're already seeing actions by the federal government when it comes to preparing some of these individuals for deportation. I would expect in the coming weeks and months to see some of these anti-Semites who are violating U.S. law, violating the rules of their colleges and universities, and violating the terms of their visas to be sent home.
You mentioned the Kennedy School, so I'm going to ask this question that somebody had said, given that this has taken place for many years, how can you combat anti-Semitism in the next generation of politicians? I mean, the Kennedy School is really, the feeder school for our, not just politicians, but our foreign policy experts and advisors. What are your thoughts on long-term implications of these issues?
The Kennedy School is an elite institution in public policy at Harvard University, although I have to say it seems that they prepare fewer politicians for elective office and more consultants for McKinsey positions nowadays. It is important to clean things up at institutions like the Kennedy School because some political appointees definitely come from there. But what we're seeing is many state legislators and then members of Congress and high-level appointees are coming through law schools, and it's law schools around the country. At the Louis D. Brandeis Center, we have been concerned for years that there is a vacuum here. On the one hand, there are anti-Zionist groups that are claiming the law schools, but on the other hand, the Jewish community, which has been so successful at supporting undergraduate students at some campuses, has not been focused on the law schools. So we at the Brandeis Center have a number of different programs that we've developed for law students, including fellowships and clerkships and also chapters at law schools. Because what we're trying to do is to build a kind of an army of Jewish lawyers who may become Jewish judges and also pro-Jewish lawyers and judges who will also become leaders in Congress and in government.
Have you come across instances of retaliation against students for expressing politically incorrect views in papers or classroom discussions? And if so, what can be done, if anything?
If this is anti-Semitic in nature, for instance, if the student is one for whom Zionism is an important part of their identity as a Jewish student, then the Brandeis Center may be able to support them as part of our fight against anti-Semitism. If it is a different sort of unpopular opinion that isn't related to anti-Semitism and the sorts of issues that we deal with at the Brandeis Center, there are other organizations that might deal with that, groups like Speech First or Southeast Legal, a number of different organizations that support people who are saying things that are unpopular and that are therefore being punished as speakers.
Someone asked, I guess as a follow-up to our discussion on the DOE and the OCR, whether there are being improvements in curriculum development that would set national standards, and would such work be ended if DOE is eliminated?
You know, it's interesting. There's always been an ambivalence about addressing curriculum at the Department of Education. There are statutes that prohibit the Department of Education from imposing curricula. These provisions have been very important when various administrations have tried to impose either Common Core or otherwise controversial curricula. Conservatives have tended to be divided on the extent to which one should be concerned for federalist reasons about federal intrusion into curricula versus more general cultural concerns about to what extent the federal government has a legitimate role to play based on its investments to make sure that federal funding is not being used in ways that violate federal law. It's been useful to see that in addition to the recent anti-Semitism executive order, President Trump also recently signed an order regarding indoctrination in K-12 institutions. That rule indicates that there may be a willingness in Washington in this coming Trump 2 administration to address curricula that are so-called wokeist, that may involve stereotypes against Jews or others, and that may have implications under federal civil rights laws. So this new executive order on indoctrination may be an early indication that the Trump 2 administration will take seriously the need to make sure that federal investments are not misused through indoctrination of elementary and secondary school students.
Ken, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody in the audience. There's a lot of questions, and I apologize to everyone that we couldn't get to them all. There's a lot to discuss. We could probably talk for another hour on these issues, but I'm sure that Emmett will have Ken back at some point in the future. And again, much appreciate you taking the time with us this afternoon, Ken. Thank you to everybody in the audience. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you all sometime in the future. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori and Kenneth. I want to remind our viewers that right now our staff is on Capitol Hill, as they are almost every single day, introducing our policymakers to the ever-changing facts and in-depth analyses about the Middle East. Please remember to support Emet to the best of your ability. We depend on your support. Donations can be made at emetonline.org. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Lori. It has been a pleasure working with you, and we're going to miss you.